So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today, and I hope that you get something from it. I guess we're trying to compact a really big subject in 1 hour and a fairly small section of time. So I have reduced it to some, I think, essential points that I hope you get some benefit from. And also, we've designed this to be for people at different levels of their career, but also different ages and from different backgrounds as well and life stages. So we have sort of focused it in that way because I think it's part of our acknowledgement, actually, that all of us, and I think people in healthcare, much more so than other sectors of the community, all of us can sort of be beholden to anxiety at different points in our life and our career. So in tonight's session, we're going to define anxiety, but perhaps in a way that I would argue, I hope, is more humane, and compassionate as well. And so we're going to look at it rather than a purely biological medical viewpoint, which is often how it's talked of, I think. We love neurology and we love neuroscience, and yes, that has a really important role, but actually it's wider than that. It's more important than just our individual brains. So we'll look at it from a social, psychological, and also a psychotherapeutic viewpoint as well, with some different thoughts and theories on what we really mean by anxiety. We'll also look at some of the mechanisms of how we not only maintain, but can make our anxiety worse and conversely improve it as well. And some of the effects and the symptoms of anxiety that we don't necessarily always think of as anxiety. And then what we'll do in the sort of second half of the session is work through some really practical ways that I hope we can provide some relief for our anxiety. And I say there, our anxiety, because we often think of in mental health, it's a particular problem, I think, that we talk of the word disorder, and there's contention around that. And it's very helpful in one way to think of someone having an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. But the question remains, is it about that individual, or is it actually about what's going on in the context around them? And I would argue that both are really important here. So why are we doing tonight? What is the problem? Let's dig into some data, really. And as Gabriel alluded to, the figures are really quite startling. And so I've titled this particular slide, The Unspoken, Unacknowledged and Underappreciated Problem, because that's what it is. But if we lift the bonnet and see what's underneath, the prevalence of anxiety amongst hospital doctors and healthcare workers of all kinds actually is really high. And as Gabriel said there, 53% of members of the HCSA have struggled with their mental health in the past 12 months. That's a sizable number. And the top three problems that people are dealing with are burnout, fatigue, and anxiety. And I would argue, they significantly overlap. 72% of members experiencing anxiety in the last 12 months. And then if we look at the NHS, we see how many sick days are lost every year. And predominantly, that is largely because of our mental ill health. And also, I think, and this is perhaps unique to healthcare in some ways, the problem is a bit more complex. Because if the person who is trying to help a patient is experiencing their own psychological problems, when they go into a ward, they might also be acutely aware that they don't want to be the problem that could create harm in a patient. And that's not the case with many other jobs. And the 2022 HSIB report highlighted that staff were concerned about their own well-being, but often the support that they needed came too late, with long waiting lists for care and help. And we know that there is a strong link between patient safety and NHS staff well-being, and that goes outside of the NHS as well. So really, if we not only care about ourselves, but also our patients, we do have to practice self-care. And that is in a system that sometimes does not do its best to encourage that. And so the anxiety that an individual feels will reside not just in them, but also to a significant degree in the structure around them. So yes, it is in our head and our body, but it's around us as well. And so let's look at what anxiety is and some thoughts and theories around that. And there are a number, but you could think of anxiety as a real fear of a perceived anticipated threat. So we really do feel that fear. And it's often to do, not always though, with our perception of what might happen, the anticipation. But if you think of it from evolutionary terms, anxiety has been life-saving. So let's normalize what it is. Anxiety is a life-preserving, self-protective mechanism, but it comes on sometimes too quickly. In healthcare, we are all too aware, though, that sometimes the threat is real. We see it on the ground, in our face, in a way that perhaps other people might not on a repetitive, hourly, daily basis. So perhaps our choice as people who work in healthcare, who are confronted by some grim realities on a frequent basis, is how do we look after ourselves within that system? How do we best manage and reduce our anxiety? And that's what we'll do tonight. Firstly, though, what I would like to do is just briefly for a moment, whenever we think of a problem, there is an inherent attentional bias in what we're focusing on. But I just want to widen that for a moment. And then really that's the theme actually of what we're going to do tonight. Yes, we may get anxious in some situations, but every single one of us who has anxiety will actually have areas of their life where other people would get anxious, but we don't. So sometimes it's really helpful to think of our resources and our skills in other areas, other aspects of our life where we don't get anxious, where we do things without really worrying too much about them. And so it's a good idea sometimes just to keep that in mind whenever we think about our problem, to think where it also isn't applicable in our life. And I think that takes us to the idea of self-compassion and understanding. The truth is that many factors contribute to anxiety. No one is exactly sure what causes anxiety. No theory will encapsulate everything. And in fact, it can be different areas that contribute to anxiety, as we'll see in a moment. But 100% of us will do anxiety. And I use the word do there as a verb because we do anxiety. It is a process. So 100% of us will do anxiety at different points in our life. And that could be much later in life or much earlier in life. It could be throughout our life, but 100% of us will experience some form of anxiety at some point, I would say. None of us are immune. So anxiety is a normal human response. But when it becomes problematic, when it starts interfering with life, or we might think of it as a disorder, it's that anxiety really distorted and really exaggerated. And there are lots of reasons why that might come about. There are contributing factors which are varied. Things like significant stressful events. Well, we've had a lot of those in the last few years, certainly. Those of us who may have experienced abuse or trauma in childhood or since are more likely to experience symptoms and disorders such as anxiety. Similarly, with bullying and oppression, whether that's something that we've experienced historically or something that might be going on for us more recently or now, that will definitely increase our anxiety. Another factor pertinent for those who work in healthcare is the aspect of moral injury. If we are in a system where we are trying to do our best, but that system is disallowing of us to do that, that can raise our anxiety because what I want to do is too far beyond my reach. Some of our learned responses, our mechanics of coping, can indeed increase our anxiety, as can unhelpful thinking styles. Obviously, we get into the area of epigenetics and hereditary factors. Things like being in a minority group or being in a lower socioeconomic group, we know, like financial worries, will increase anxiety for many people. The sense of abandonment and loss, our temperament will come into that. Often a feeling of powerlessness is joined at the hip with anxiety, that lack of agency. Things like technology and repeated difficulty with IT, for example, will, I don't think this really needs to be said in a way, but perhaps we do need to remember it, that can increase our anxiety. Too much neurological stimulation or repetitive stimulation of the same thing, stimulants as well, including caffeine. And then we also go into the area of alcohol and drugs, which some people may use to try to self-soothe their anxiety, but will actually make it worse over time. And one other very vital thing in order to balance our systems is how well have we developed our own ability to self-soothe. So there are situations that will increase our anxiety. What are our self-soothing styles like? How good are we at doing that? So the effects of anxiety are wide and varied. And so what I'd like to do now, and we can use the chat facility for this just for a minute or two, really, really quickly, is to look at how anxiety manifests in us. What are the symptoms that we experience? So what I've done is on the screen now, I've put 3 categories: the physical effect, the psychological effects and symptoms, and then the behavioral effects. And what I'd like you to do is just look down this list, and we won't read anyone's name out when we do this, but if you want to type in the chat box the things that maybe stand out to you when you experience anxiety, how it manifests in you, what do you notice? Some of us may immediately feel it in our gut, and that's a very obvious thing with bowel changes, and go to the loo more often, say. It can be often that fast, dysregulated breathing that we get, but it might also be into the area of the psychological. Maybe more reassurance seeking sometimes at work, checking our decisions more times than is really clinically necessary. It could be also ruminating, thinking about past experiences or mistakes or things that have gone wrong, but we keep thinking about it over and over again. And I bet if we're honest, all of us can tick some of these boxes. Of course we can, because it would be abnormal, I think, not to occasionally get these things. But one of the things in healthcare we might do is kind of minimize the effect that things have on us in the real world. We kind of pretend it's not happening. So just for a moment now, let's be honest and notice the effects that we experience. So some people have started writing the chat box already, and I'd like you to, if you wish. We've had people saying sleep problems, avoidant behaviors is one of them. And I would say that that's often, very, very common thing with anxiety. Rumination and sleep problems again. I wonder whether you notice that sometimes you might have, say, scattered thinking. That's something I know I get. If I get anxious, my thoughts are here, there, and all over the place. Sometimes it can also, because of that, then be a difficulty in our following a train of thought. So that can impact, obviously, our work. Someone has said here, worrying people are angry or upset with me. And I'm so glad someone has said that, because it is actually a very common sign of anxiety that we might then go back and you say, now, I know that you said you're okay, but are you sure you're not angry with me? And so we can get into that unhelpful reassurance seeking. So these are really important things to notice in us. These are incredibly important aspects of anxiety. And the reason that I've attended to them and I've asked you to really think for yourself about them is that we don't like them. To be really honest, we really sometimes despise these parts of ourselves, because as a human, we all have parts of us that are imperfect and insane, and that we indeed are then a bit frightened of, to say the least, because other people might think, oh, I don't want to go near your madness, if you like. So what we do psychologically is something called splitting. And so we have this part of us that gets anxious and we think, oh, I wish you'd just go away. And so we split this part. We split ourselves into the good part of me, the bit that's very palatable and really acceptable to everyone. And I look great like this. And then the other part of me that I get anxious, and I must never let anyone see that part of me. So I kind of try and split it off over there. And what happens is it actually makes it worse, because we try and outcast this part of us that actually needs compassion and help. And furthermore, we then have a really faulty perception of ourselves when we are anxious. We think of ourselves as being this weird character. And actually, the first step is to change this, I think. that we all get anxious at different points. And even if it is quite a generalized anxiety that we have, we've already seen how common that is, and that it is not just about us as a person, it's about us as a person in a wider context, such as a healthcare setting, where, my goodness me, there are enough things to drive people absolutely crazy sometimes. So the way we think about our anxiety can have a huge impact on the effect it actually has. So if we think of our anxiety in a very uncompassionate, discompassionate way, and we think, oh, that's such a terrible thing, and I really wish it wasn't there. And of course it is unwanted, but if we shame ourselves about it, it will increase our anxiety. It will certainly increase our depression too, and our sense of guilt or stupidity. And that then can take us to a place of unhealthy anger. So sometimes around anxiety, like depression, you see that we can, be quite irritable as well. So an attempt to become compassionate here, and I say attempt because compassionate is a developed skill, is, I think, the order of the day, so that we can express concern for ourselves and others, and an understanding of what might be contributing to our anxiety, with also a perspective on how that comes about. I think anxiety is a bit like, and you may not be as old as I am now, I can't believe I'm saying that, but I am, of Rubik's Cubes. And if you don't know what they are, Google Rubik's Cubes, because they were a sort of a toy in the 1980s. And you had to solve this puzzle, which I could never do. And anxiety is a bit like that. To get the full squares with the same color on each side, actually a whole load of complex equations come together. I think that's like any problem in mental health, actually. So there is a perspective that we need. And yes, that might make us sad, and we might be disappointed, not just with ourselves sometimes, but also with the system in which we work. And that can result in perhaps healthy anger that we might use constructively. And very importantly, when we're being compassionate with ourselves, it's also about a healthy, practical way of solving problems pragmatically. And so I would say that a more accurate and honest and realistic approach to anxiety is something along these lines. I'm a human being who chose to be a medic or work in healthcare. And when I chose that, at whatever age in my late teens probably that I was, or in my 20s or 30s, I probably couldn't have truly known the reality of the day-to-day, the complexity of doing this job, that the job is hard and it can make some people very anxious. And I have a tendency to get anxious, and that's a sign that I care about the value of life, including my own. And there are many inputs to my anxiety that are often unspoken and unacknowledged by the system. And I can control some of those inputs, but not others. One of my clients about a year or so ago said something I thought was really interesting. They said, I realised that working in the NHS is a bit like being in a Petri dish. And so there are organisms in that Petri dish that interact with each other. And our goal of anxiety is not to eliminate it. It is to reduce it, to transform worry from an uncontrollable, very scattered thing that we're avoidant of things because of this. Our goal is to transform it to that distortion to a more controlled and limited problem-solving approach to life. So it's not so much that we worry, that's not so much the problem, it's the way in which we worry and the complex that we build around those thoughts with behaviours too. That is what is actually creating our problem. So there's a good delineation that we can make between what you could argue is unproductive worry, which is where it's distal. So it's right at the end of my arm. It's not in the shoulder cap. It's the end of my fingers and my hand, where something is out of my focus. So I'm thinking too far in the future and it's all a bit foggy and hazy. And I therefore have very little control over the outcome. Because of that, there is then a greater likelihood that I will focus on the negative, but with less control over those things. And that then increases my intolerance of imperfect solutions. So things are snowballing now. And then I'm thinking, well, this is really making me anxious. So I have a desire for a greater certainty of outcome. And then I have an exaggerated estimation of threat. And obviously that results in a higher level of personal distress. So that's what we could think of as unproductive worry. And let's see if we can get to a place where it's more productive. So I focus on the proximal, the closer to my shoulder cap, if you like, the stuff that is maybe more immediately doable and realistic as well, where I do have a greater degree perhaps over some of the outcome. And therefore I can focus, and my camera is now better focused on problem solving with the tasks in hand. And with that, I can see if I can develop a greater tolerance of imperfect solutions and reasonable risk and reasonable uncertainty, because in healthcare, we know that there are uncertainties, many, many uncertainties. And we can also develop an awareness of a range of outcomes, and that tends to reduce our level of distress. The reason that uncertainty is an important aspect of anxiety to get our heads around is that our brain, as you can see in a moment, views any kind of uncertainty sometimes as a threat. And especially if I have had trauma, and if I've had burnout, and if I've had very, very repeated stressful events in my life, then I can tend with anxiety to view any uncertainty not as an opportunity, but as a loss or a threat, so that uncertainty then becomes something that I just can't tolerate emotionally, cognitively, or indeed behaviorally. So often with anxiety, we kind of restrict our lives and we reduce our lives and we take the pleasure out of our lives as well. And we develop this aversion to anxiety, to uncertainty, and we really try and avoid it, you know. And then what happens as well, this is very pessimistic, so we're going to come to the more optimistic stuff in a minute, but our preoccupations then become intrusive and very threat orientated. So why does that happen? Well, there are, as you may or may not know, particular parts of our brain that are definitely going to get involved in this process, and that's what it is. And the amygdala is one of them. So the amygdala is a very small but yet very powerful part of the brain that does a number of things, including having a role in our threat response. And we know that when people have generalized anxiety disorder, they will experience greater bilateral, so both sides of the brain, greater amygdala activation in both sides than, if you like, healthy comparison subjects. I don't like that word. And that is during the anticipation of events. So it's not that there's a real thing, it's that we've had a thought that there might be a thing, or we've seen a stimuli that makes us think there might be a real thing, but it's not real. It's just our anticipation of this. But the amygdala is going like this and really distorting things. So we've got some imaging stuff there. And what happens then is, if you were to have 10 possible outcomes of a situation, wherever it is, at home or at work or elsewhere, the amygdala is overfiring essentially. And so of what could be 10 perfectly neutral outcomes, if my amygdala is overfiring with anxiety and threat response, I see 9 of them, if not 10 of them, as negative or threat orientated, and maybe only one as positive or okay. I can see all things, if I'm not careful, as negative. And that's why with anxiety, it often brings a sense of pessimism as well, which is why we have to be really careful that anxiety doesn't progressively get worse over time. So in other words, neutral outcomes that I've just thought of might be possible. My amygdala is saying, no, they're going to be dreadful. So this is worded from that piece of research that some of those images are based from in this way, as a summary. The anticipation of adverse outcomes, so not real but anticipated, is a cardinal symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. So we can conclude from this that heightened and indiscriminate amygdala responses to anticipatory signals are the order of the day, if you like, with anxiety. So they're heightened, but they're also indiscriminate. They're all over the place. And I like reading this because I think it can be really helpful, because it tells us that we know our brains can be hypervigilant. They can be exaggerative. And we can see threat where it might not be, where often it isn't actually. But we have this weird thing where we might think something and therefore think it's going to be true. So if we know that this is a distortion in the amygdala and other parts of the brain, it means that we don't have to collude with what our anxious thoughts are telling us. And we don't have to collude with some of the behaviors like checking that can go along with anxiety. So the take-home message from this that I think is really important is we don't have to collude with our anxious thinking. Because if we do, we have a much more narrow way of experiencing our thinking and the world and ourselves. We tend, with anxiety, like a number of other problems, to experience with anxiety very narrow thinking that's also very fractured. It's also very repetitive. It's fixed, so it's hard to shift. And it's also really fixated. So it's a bit like playing a song over and over and over again. And then we turn the volume up and it feels a bit too much for us, actually. And it can feel also punitive as well. And this is where we also stray into the realm of very critical self-judgment. And these are distortions in the brain. And if you know or have read any research on a sort of an emerging area, by the way, of neuroscience, it's called the default mode network. And it's akin to this, where it's a bit like getting stuck in a washing machine. So what I'm proposing here is that we can all benefit with anxiety from a gentler way of being with ourselves, actually, that is, we're aiming to develop a wider way of thinking that can be more realistic, more flexible, more compassionate, more understanding, and also more creative as well. So we're trying to transform from rigid ways of thinking and rigid ways of doing to a more flexible approach where we go with, frankly, the ebb and flow of life. So it's an adaptive response to what's going on around us, as opposed to this very rigid way of being. And so we have a Darwin quote here about, the adaptation that we need. Not necessarily being the most intelligent, but actually the ones who are most responsive to change and circumstance. So let's come on to the stuff that can help us then, because with anxiety, there are structures, or a complex, if you like, that we develop around anxiety. And by changing these structures, what we're seeking to do is to separate these cogs so they don't make each other turn as much. So we're trying to reduce avoidant behavior, things that we might not go near because it has made us anxious before. If I avoid, it will actually increase my anxiety. So sometimes when we are trying to change our anxiety, there will be actually a slight increase occasionally, but then that's followed by this reduction, because we're going for the thing that we've been avoiding and we think, well, I can't possibly do that. And then once we've done it, it's like, actually, I coped with that. It was all right. So distorted thoughts are something also that are one of these cogs, and we're trying to reduce that distortion. We're also trying to become more tolerant of uncertainty, actively become more tolerant of it. And you may notice my little joke here about perfectionism. Because it was a few years ago where I realized, oh my goodness, I am a perfectionist. And I thought, well, I can't be a perfectionist because my kitchen is a complete mess. It's not a complete mess, but I have to remember to tidy it up. And surely perfectionists will have a really ordered kitchen, and that really isn't the case, because one of the things with perfectionism, I might avoid doing some things because it's either got to be exactly right or I won't bother at all. So again, it's this flexibility we're developing. And I see I put intolerance of uncertainty twice there. Maybe that's another joke. So let's come on to the practical things that can help. Just as anxiety is created by many things, as we've seen, lots of things contribute, lots of things will increase and decrease it. And therefore we can use that to our advantage, that we can provide ourselves relief and reduction, not elimination, but relief and reduction of anxiety in a number of different ways. And as the famous psychologist who I love, Carl Rogers, he said, no one else can know how we perceive. We are the best experts on ourselves. And it's true that, you know, we can have suggestions from other people, but it's only really through our own experimentation we realize and we learn how to reduce our anxiety, how we provide relief for ourselves. So we can provide suggestions for patients, but we know that, you know, sometimes they'll do what they're going to do anyway, but they may take on some of those suggestions, but it's only when they try them on and realize that they offer benefit for them, genuine benefit, that they may really inherit them properly, if you like. So I've just done a very quick ad hoc chart, which will be on the resource handout that we provide with today's training. So like medication, there is experimentation with types and dosing that we need to do psychologically and behaviorally and emotionally for ourselves. So my suggestion to you after today is that you can try one thing for a while to see how that helps, what relief it brings, and you can track it if you want. And tracking symptoms is quite a big part of cognitive behavioral therapy, which if you've done it, you'll know. Sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes it can feel like yet another burden for people. So I don't want to add too much here, but to keep a note of things can be really helpful sometimes. So how we are self-caring, you know, did I go and see my friends the other night and did that help me? Was my distress and my anxiety higher or lower when I did this or when I thought that? What did I think differently? We're going to come on to these things in a moment in more detail, but I think it is helpful to track it. So noticing what we do differently in our own lives and experimenting with those things, it also means that we can be the person who's more in control of our own life close to us. And we can notice how things have made us feel and how things have benefited us. So one of the benefits and one of the changes that we can do is to change our thinking. And as I've said already, that in anxious states, our brains can think and behave in very, very different ways, much more distorted, much more inflexible and fixated than we may behave in other times. And lots of different types of therapies have their own way of saying this, but broadly speaking, it's really true. And neuroscience backs us up on this, that in anxious states, you know, we're very different people. So let's see if we can get to a place where we can think more resourcefully. So this page is going to be on the handout because it's too much, frankly, for us to go through right now. But I'm alluding to it because it can help in many ways, that we know we have distorted thoughts when we're anxious. And what can be helpful is to notice how you do anxious thinking. What are the types of thought that you have? So the CBT thinks of 10 of these. Very all or nothing thinking, which is, you know, I'm a total success or I'm a failure, right? So it's very black or white, very polarized. Or I catastrophize, thinking I'm going to be really so upset when that happens and I just won't be able to function at all, as opposed to, well, I might be upset and I might be genuinely upset by something and I might be able to function not at my best, but kind of okay enough, you see? So that's a way of moderating and widening our thinking. Also, with distorted thoughts, we disqualify positive things because, as you've seen, that's what our brain does. We don't think about the positive. We think about the threat, the negative, the thing that we're going to lose, except we might not, of course. We also do something called emotional reasoning, where, you know I do a lot of things okay at work, but I still feel like I'm a failure, so I must be. And then we label ourselves. We can distort and magnify or minimize things. We apply these mental filters so that we do have an attentional bias only to some things and not on others. So I got a low rating in one of my exams or an evaluation, and that means I must be lousy at my job. We can also do mind reading, and this is perhaps what someone in the chat box said earlier, where, you know, our anxious brain says, do you know that tiny micro look on that person's face, because our eyes read a huge amount of data unconsciously from people's faces, the pallor, the redness in someone's skin, if I saw that, that might mean they're angry with me. So in fact, I know that they're angry with me and I start mind reading as well. And then I can overgeneralize, where I, make big distorted thoughts. I can also personalize. So I think that someone was rude to me, and that must be something because a flaw in me that they were rude. They must have a gripe with me, whereas they might just have been having a bad day. We can also do should or must statements, so that it's terrible because I made a mistake. I should always do my best. What happens when we can't always do 100%? And we get this tunnel vision. So I'm sure you can map across that diagram I showed you of very narrow thinking with this portion of CBT. So what I'm going to do is put this on a resource sheet, because it's too far to think of tonight. It's too much. But knowing these thoughts, even if you think, well, do you know what? All or nothing thinking is something I do a lot of. If you just attend to that, it will have a reduction in your anxiety when you bring more nuance to it. One of the really interesting pieces of feedback that I've often heard from patients, but I also now know myself through having PTSD, is that, and I never realized it until I had PTSD for in truth. I never realized how this actually felt, if I'm honest. That when we have anxiety, we are so convinced about our thinking. And one of the things that often patients on discharge will say is that, looking back at those early thought sheets, I realize now that some of my thoughts made no sense. Not every thought was true. Some of those things that I was convinced would happen, they didn't. And some of my thoughts in hindsight were driven by other things going on or other people. And I think that this is really helpful to remember. We can be so convinced about our thoughts, and yet if we keep some distance from our thoughts. So in the handouts, I've also provided something that I call a dispute diary. So we can write down our thoughts, and frankly, we can start disputing some of them. So we can write down a thought that we might have of something we predict is going to happen, that I'm worried that I haven't scored well in an evaluation and I think I'm going to be, really reprimanded for this. And maybe we might have had an experience where that's happened, so we can be convinced it's going to happen again. Or I'm worried people won't like me. So I can, in the dispute diary, write down my worst predictions or my worst fears or anxiety about an event that's coming up. And rather than avoiding the event or the circumstance, I go into it and I take into it my anxiety, and I notice how that maybe compares to reality. So with this dispute diary, I have 3 columns. Before the event, where I list all my worries, and I do this properly. I don't kind of skate around. I say, I'm absolutely terrified that this is going to happen. And out of 10, I've got a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 with my absolute sheer terror at this. And I still go to the event, or I still face into this difficult situation. And then after the event, I notice what actually happened, and I review my thoughts a day, a week, a month, and even 6 months later, and I compare my thoughts with the reality. And then in the 3rd column, I look at what has actually changed. What was reality about? And if I do this over time, I start being able to see that I don't have to trust my anxious thoughts as much. But frankly, it's only through our own experimentation that we start to feel for ourselves, I don't have to go where my anxious brain is telling me. And I think this can be very important for those who work in very cerebral jobs, because in medicine, the role of cognition is really important. Assessing, interpreting, diagnosing, treating, these are really brain-heavy activities. So we can cherish every thought we have, but if we cherish anxious thoughts, distorted ones, they can have a grip on us. So this is an idea called cognitive diffusion that we're thinking of now. So what we're trying to do is diffuse from our thoughts. We see thoughts as just thoughts. We don't have to be beholden to our thoughts. There are a number of metaphors for this, but one I've put here is that a thought is like a cloud that just floats by in the sky. We could, look at every cloud, we could fixate on that cloud, we could believe everything in that cloud, or we could just notice it is simply and only a thought. And I think it's something to really practice with, and our brain then can develop this greater flexibility with our thinking. We don't have to take our thoughts so seriously. So those are thoughts. Let's look at our behaviors, because they're a big part of anxiety disorders. And with our behaviors, what we try and do sometimes is fixate on everything in the world that we can control. And it's about trying to delineate and distinguish between what is truly in my control and what is outside of my control. There are many, many things outside our control, and some of us, we don't like to admit it, frankly. I know I don't. It was a bit of a wake-up call when I realized how much I like to have things under control. And we don't, actually. So it can create real problems in us and also those around us sometimes. So yeah, there are things that we can control. They're proximal, they're close to us, but there are things that we just can't control. And I do think that we live in an age now where the media can have a real role in this. And my background is probably a great explanation of why I ended up working in mental health and psychotherapy. I used to work in the media, and I worked in TV news for a while. And the way in which, especially now, headlines are cut and clickbaity media is, it's very good at grabbing our attention, and it's also very good at escalating and distorting our thoughts. And we can fixate on these things like they're the most important thing in the world, and actually they may take care of themselves sometimes, not always, but sometimes. But even if they don't take care of themselves, we might not have control over them. But the media and our own minds can make us believe that we can control those outcomes, so we fixate on them. And actually, what can be very helpful is to just come back to center ourselves on the things that we can control. No psychological problem ever lives in isolation. We've, throughout history, used all kinds of things to help regulate ourselves. And therapy is a relatively new thing if you think about, how long we've been around as humankind. I think there have been different kinds of therapies as well, not just the formal kind. The reality is that some medical environments can be very dysregulating of our systems and our bodies, and threatening as well. So throughout history, humans have used each other where possible to co-regulate. And I think this is kind of obvious, but it's still worth stating. We know that social contact in and of itself, good social contact that's safe enough, helps to regulate our brain and our body to bring anxiety in a more regulated way, to bring it down, if you like. So the psychologist Susan Pinker stated that direct person-to-person contact triggers parts of our nervous system that release a cocktail of neurotransmitters tasked with regulating our response to stress and anxiety. As she said, face-to-face contact is like a vaccine. And to throw some theory in here, but very quickly because of time, there is an emerging area of psychology and neuroscience called polyvagal theory, which you can Google, and there's quite a lot written about it, and sometimes it's oversimplified. And I'm probably going to do that now. But I think it talks of that social aspect very importantly. I've worked with many clients who, in their attempt to reduce our anxiety, have then started to, say, socialize more, and that in and of itself has helped to reduce our anxiety. A problem shared is a problem halved, etc. So with polyvagal theory, the idea is that our nervous systems can go from this sort of what's called the ventral vagal, the very social green area, if you like. This is a real thing in our body, the vagal nerve. And it's where we feel each other and we regulate each other and we're in communion with each other. And that has a tremendously beneficial effect on our nervous systems. Things like humor and playfulness, stuff that pets and cats and dogs often know. So that's in the ventral vagal, where we experience joy, being in the present, socializing with not just other people, but it might be nature, it can be music, it can be sharing a joke with someone, it can be watching a film together, sensory pleasure, sex is in there, obviously, curiosity with each other, compassion, a sense of being at ease with each other. Those are all in that green. When we're in a system that keeps activating us, we can go into the red. And we all need to go in the red sometimes, which is where we get into things like fear and panic and worry and anxiety, and also rage and frustration and irritation. And after a while, that can take us then into what's known as a freeze response in the dorsal vagal, which is where we can start getting depression and dissociate from the world and ourselves, and we kind of shut down. We can also feel very isolated, and that's where shame can come in. Now, all of us are going to actually move through all three of these categories. With anxiety, the danger is that we get stuck in the middle and the top, and we forget the bottom. So a very good way of reducing anxiety is to start socializing, not just with people, but different things that can bring us joy and pleasure. And what that can do is change the things in our minds that we perceive as my problem, anxiety, the things that I'm worried about. And I think, we kind of know this in one way, but it's important again to remind ourselves that it's not just the problem that we have, it's what's called the relational field, the way we see that problem, the way we feel that problem, that's really important. So when we start doing more playful things, we still have our problems, but they're now in a different perspective. They're smaller, they have less impact. When we start doing other things that can bring us a genuine sensory joy in our life, a playfulness, pleasure, now our anxiety, our problems are in a different perspective. And so that's why avoidant behaviors are such a problem with anxiety, and which is why we're trying to seek to reduce those so that we can also experience things that do bring us joy. So my question to you now is, what do you need to do actively in your life for self-care? Self-care is a phrase that's used so much within healthcare for practitioners of all levels, and yet it's often thought of like having a bath or lighting a candle or something. I think we need to go a bit further than that, actually, so we really feel what brings us pleasure in order to put our anxiety in a perspective. So my question for you is, just for a couple of minutes, are there one or two things you could stop doing? And that might be pushing back on stuff that is not a realistic ask of you at work. I know that in some settings and trusts and organizations, staff are bombarded sometimes with extra requests, and the people sending them, might not realize the full burden that adds on staff. So sometimes stopping doing some things and pushing back on things that are not realistic might be helpful. So the tertiary and extracurricular stuff that we might be asked to do sometimes. Or it might be where you're trying too hard. Someone said earlier of piling on more work. That's a very common thing with anxiety. Maybe we need to be brave here and say, no, I'm not doing more of that. And then what one or two things, and we only need one or two to really experiment with this, could you start doing? So someone has said here, and I think it's important thing, if you need to push back on stuff, then obviously that could be a question for managers and unions as well, obviously, to be responsible. But I'm also talking outside of work as well. How much pressure might you put on yourself to achieve certain things or to be perfect, say? Maybe we can just push back on that a bit. And what one or two things could you start doing? Maybe if you want, you could just very briefly for time, just whatever your thoughts are, and I won't read any names out, but if you want to write them in the chat box, please do. What one or two things could you start doing that would bring you pleasure? What might it be? What parts of you are neglected at the moment? So someone has said here, stop picking up extra shifts. Yeah. At what cost do we do those? Might it be better sometimes just to see friends or have a bit more sleep if we need it as well? Because if we are having sleep problems, for example, and starting to work or aiming to leave work rather at a set time. Yeah, because when we put those boundaries in, systems may well adjust around us. But otherwise, we might presume that the system couldn't possibly cope without us. And that will only increase that conditioning. So maybe after tonight, you could also think about one or two things, and it only needs to be that to start, just to really create a domino effect here. So someone has said, I'm trying not to deal with anything work related outside of work time. And it does prove nigh on impossible, and it's very frustrating. And even small increments into that can be meaningful. So, one of the things I've stopped doing is I used to be very, I'm not wordy in emails, but I used to try and be very, very polite. And I now just use smileys and emojis sometimes, or do acronyms instead, because I don't really want to check all my spelling with things. We never had that pressure 20 years ago. I'm showing my age now, but there's another pressure on people that will increase our stress. So sometimes it can be those small things, and when we do them, other people may also say, oh, I saw that, and actually I can do the same now. So we can teach each other ways to self-care. So we normalize here the idea of serenity, play, and pleasure. We know that pleasure reduces anxiety. So in and of itself, it's like those old scales that we used to, or Victorians had, when we do one thing, it will have an effect on others. So when we increase our pleasure, it will always reduce our anxiety. And someone has said here, stop checking emails every hour. Absolutely. So in the handouts that we'll provide, I won't do this now because of time, but a lot is spoken of mindfulness. And I think we can be mindful in the things that we do. So if I'm cooking, I can really be mindful of the smell of something, or when I'm eating, I can eat mindfully. That's really what's meant by mindfulness. But there are also exercises you can do, and this is in a bit more detail on the handout that we'll provide you. A mindfulness in 5 minutes. This is where to leave a building, when we're having a break or something, could be helpful. So we change our environment. So we deliberately go somewhere else. Maybe if it's cold outside, actually that can be really helpful, because that can change our neurology as well. And we can do 5 stages of mindfulness in 5 minutes. This is just a pragmatic way of doing mindfulness, realistic in time. So we bring an awareness to our senses. Yes, it's a bit colder outside, and I probably want to run back inside because it's cold, but actually it's only 5 minutes, and I can notice what this feels like. I can also notice the disturbance to my system that I've had, maybe because of work as well. And then I can notice what brings me either some pleasure or feelings of safety, and I can get some perspective on my problems, realizing that yes, I am stressed because of this today, but I can deal with other stresses before, and so can other people as well, and that can widen our mind. And then at the end of it, I notice the difference. So there'll be a more comprehensive version of this on the handout. And just before we finish, it is important, the idea of experimenting that I said earlier, to recognize that any true change is genuinely step by step. Reducing our anxiety is not a quick fix, and I don't think it should be either, really, because deep change, genuine, authentic, personal change is over time, and it is step by step. We have some resources here for you that, again, will be on the handout with the web links as well. And as Gabriel will say, I'm sure in a second, absolutely look at the website for the HCSA for the Wellbeing Programme. We've also listed here some organisations. It's worth, as Gabriel said, if you are suffering at the moment with your mental health, absolutely talk to your GP, seek help and seek support. I know that sometimes there are long waiting lists, but that may not be the case necessarily where you are. And it's not a reason for you not to seek some support and at least try to open that door. We've also got the web link in the handout for Doctors in Distress, an amazing charity, as well as a Doctors Support Network, some facts and figures you'll find on physician burnout, and also from NHS employees as well. Bullying is, I know, a repetitive problem in some NHS trusts that a number of people are attempting to crack down on. It absolutely has an effect on our mental health. So if you are suffering because of bullying at the moment, I urge you to seek support and help and change for that. And I've also included the web link for a charity called Anxiety UK. So it's 8 o'clock now, and we will send you the resources. I think we're going to send you those tomorrow. And just one quick plug, next year, early next year, I'm working on it at the moment with someone else, and we're developing a course, an online anxiety program over 6 to 8 weeks, specifically designed for healthcare professionals. And if you would like the details of that, it's going to be early next year. Please do message me directly. There's my email address, mark@markbailey.net, and then we can send you the full details of that program. And it will be an hour every week over 6 to 8 weeks. So Gabriel, thank you very much. And I'll hand back to you now.
Mark, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. Huge amount for that. Thank you for everyone who chimed in. Oh, we're getting some hearts in the chat, which is fantastic to see. Thanks for everyone who chimed in with your thoughts and experiences as well. So helpful and really powerful to hear the things that people are themselves experiencing working in healthcare. If anyone has questions for Mark, now's your time. You can get those in the chat or in the Q&A function. Please do that rather than raising your hand. You can type it in the Q&A or in the chat down at the bottom of your screen. You have the option to ask it anonymously, but if you don't want to be anonymous, we will bring you up to ask a question on the screen yourself, or I'll unmute you and grant you permission to speak. So now is the time to pipe up if you'd like. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I guess just whilst people are getting their sort of creative juices flowing on some questions, Mark, I'm asking you to retread a little bit of ground here because you're so thorough in that presentation. But let's say practically, I am a healthcare professional. I'm a doctor or another sort of allied health professional, and I've gone through this really positive process of recognition that you've sort of set out here for us this evening, and I've sort of sought to sort of make change by going to sort of my line manager at work. And sort of like mentioning this issue, and I'm not really seeing any change that's really sort of helped me or whatever. I've not perhaps got the response I want, or the desired effects haven't been had. I'm still finding perhaps that my experience at work is increasing my experience of anxiety, or that I'm still having difficulty with certain aspects of work as a result of feeling anxious. What would my first step or couple of steps be then, just practically? Where could I turn? You I think laid out for us lots of fantastic resources and different sort of modes of thinking and ways of taking positive steps. But if I'm in that first sort of situation, I've kind of made my first attempt to official channels. And it's not really, I've been sort of knocked back and I'm not feeling hugely positive. Where might I go for support or self-support? What might you recommend as sort of an initial step?
Well, I think there are probably two channels that I would recommend, and I sort of bring in some of my knowledge from training NHS professionals and from other healthcare organisations as well. I think there are two channels really. One is where we use delegation, and genuinely, I think, generally rather, it's about the escalation that we need to raise to the point of change. So we go to the locus of control. And I know that sometimes, having spoken to chief executives of trusts occasionally, they genuinely really don't want poor practices at work, but they might not know about them. And we may have this delusion that they do, and that they just don't care, where that really may not be the case. It might be, but it is very likely not to be the case, but they don't know the details of something. So I think what we want to do is delegate and escalate to the point of change. So that's a very pragmatic thing. I think the other thing to go along with that is, with delegation, it can feel very often an isolating experience, and it will raise our anxiety. So we will often avoid that because we think, well, no one's going to listen, but also I don't want to be doing this on my own. So I think having allies is really important, so that we're not the only voice saying something, that we have, a union, and that we have unity in what we're saying, because there's a numbers game, frankly, that is important here. If enough people are saying something, we know that then that can increase the likelihood of change. So I think that's one side of it. And I think then the other side is about, on a more day-to-day, perhaps a day-to-day basis, how we look after ourselves. And it's really vital to have support structures in place, and self-care, practical self-care as well, active self-care, for in our own lives away from work. So we have a strong boundary between work and our own home lives.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Mark. Really clear. That makes perfect sense to me. It's reassuring, if nothing else. And the point about collective action, I think, and sort of strength in numbers, and presenting a sort of an evidence-based case, I think is a really powerful one as well. And once again, I'd beat the drum of self-promotion and ask people to visit hcsa.com/join. Or if you're not a hospital doctor working in the NHS or private practice, check out what might be the best trade union for you if you're not already a trade union member. You can just type into Google, find a union, and the Trades Union Congress has a really useful tool where you can tell them about your role, and it will point you in the right direction. The union might be right for you. We've got a question here in the chat from Deshelle, and I'm going to ask Deshelle to sort of come up on the screen for us and ask her a question directly, if that's all right. It's, I suppose, a little bit of a sort of work-based question. Maybe, Deshelle, we could we'll maybe take this in a slightly more sort of general direction to sort of talk perhaps about the ideas in here. So Deshelle, I'm going to ask you I'm going to enable you to unmute. I'm going to ask you to put your question to Mark, please. You should now be able to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the excellent, useful talk. You've packed a lot into the slides and the hour. The thing that I saw on your on the on the slide with about the shame and the three colors where people spoke in that. One thing that resonated was, I found that it has been difficult to help patients with a lot of shame that they experience during childhood, and they're very worried about being laughed at, what people might think of them. So it's very pervasive into adulthood and all of their decisions, but not all, most of their decisions. So it's really hard to root that out or help them get out of that. I wonder if you have any ideas how we might approach, short of referring to a psychologist to
and I think
and that would be helpful too, of course.
Yeah, and obviously that's there as well. And I think most, if not all, shame is rooted somewhere in childhood, and often we may not necessarily and explicitly know where that comes from in ourselves as well as patients. We don't know how those things are formed, but they are definitely formed from early childhood experiences in most cases, and adversity. One of the weird things about shame is it's often a foremost writer about shame is someone called Brené Brown, and she talks about shame being in a petri dish with secrecy, essentially. And so just the act of someone sharing, say, their symptomology with someone, or sharing an experience with a healthcare professional where that person doesn't jump or run away from them and doesn't condemn them, will in and of itself, I think in many, many cases, have a positive and sometimes profound effect. And that person also unconsciously learns that they don't have to kind of run away from themselves either, because they now have a new model of someone not disowning them when they talk about their vulnerabilities or their embarrassments or their mistakes, etc. They have a new model of relating to themselves from our own actions. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. That's excellent. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Michelle, for that question. Fantastic. Unless we've got any more right now, I think that might be it. I think that really thorough presentation, Mark, has covered all bases, which is fantastic. Thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for those who've asked a question. Thanks for all your participation and comments in the chat. Really fantastic. I guess that's all that's left for me to do is give a very big thanks to Mark Bailey, our brilliant guest and host this evening. That was really fantastic stuff. As I said before, this session has been recorded, and the presentation section will be available to view at a later date on HCSA's YouTube channel. We'll let you know when it's ready. Again, I will direct you to those brilliant resources that Mark collated for us. You'll receive those via email from us in the coming days. And I'd also encourage you to engage with Mark on his project, healthcare professionals. That's coming early in the new year, I believe. And Mark, again, what was the best email address for people to reach you if they wanted to get involved in that?
So it's very easy to remember. It's mark@markbailey.net.
That's markbailey.net. It's in the chat right now. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Thank you, everyone. And good night. Thank you.